Science has always been about discovering new things and pushing the limits of what we know. But sometimes, the quest for new knowledge leads researchers into dangerous experiments, resulting in terrible outcomes that change history. Ethics are often ignored, and people are used without getting their consent. What were these experiments, and how did they go so wrong? Join us as we uncover 15 science experiments that went horribly wrong. Scientists create the world's first see-through frog. In 2007, scientists at Hiroshima University's Institute for Amphibian Biology tried something fascinating. They created the world's first see-through frogs. The team, made up of experts in amphibian biology, wanted to change how medical research was done. Their goal was to study the internal organs and blood vessels of frogs without needing to dissect or kill them. This new approach promised to help in drug testing, genetic research, and finding treatments for diseases like cancer. But things weren't perfect. Even though the frogs weren't killed for research, they still had to endure injections of various chemicals to test how their bodies reacted. This caused the frogs stress and raised concerns about their treatment. The see-through frogs allowed scientists to learn more, but the ethical questions about using animals in experiments became a major issue. The results of the experiment were mixed. On one hand, the frogs helped scientists find new, less invasive ways to study living organisms. Fewer animals might need to be killed in future research because of this innovation. On the other hand, the experiment showed how complicated and controversial animal testing can be. But then, it is just one experiment that many still talk about. The next on our list will blow your mind. Gender gap. In 1965, a psychologist named John Money made a decision that changed the life of baby Bruce Reimer forever. Bruce, just 8 months old, went through a circumcision that went horribly wrong, leaving his penis severely damaged. John Money, a well-known expert in gender studies at the time, suggested a drastic solution: reassignment surgery. Bruce was turned into Brenda, raised as a girl.
He was the victim of a bizarre gender experiment, a boy forced to live his childhood as a girl,
while his twin brother Brian was raised as a boy. The goal of this experiment was to prove that upbringing, not biology, determines gender identity. But things didn't go as planned. Brenda never felt like a girl and insisted that something wasn't right. Despite this, the adults around her continued pretending she was female. The experiment ignored her feelings and identity, leading to years of emotional pain. This was a major ethical failure, as no one considered how this would affect Bruce's life and mental health. The results were tragic. At 14, Brenda learned the truth about her past and began living as a boy again, choosing the name David. But the damage was already done.
Medicine has to remain a mixture of science and art.
Years of surgeries, secrets, and confusion had left deep, emotional scars. David battled depression for much of his life. Learning that the experiment on him had been labeled a success, leading to more surgeries on other babies, only made things worse. At age 38, David Reimer took his own life. David's story raised awareness about the dangers of such practices and influenced changes in how doctors and researchers handle gender-related issues.
Oh, I'm a boy today. It's in you.
The Stanford Prison Experiment. Psychologist Philip Zimbardo led the Stanford Prison Experiment in 1971 to study how power and control affect behavior.
You're kidding, right?
Okay, boys, let's take her down there and show her just how pretty she looks.
He used students from Stanford University and turned the basement of the psychology building into a fake prison. There were 24 volunteers who were paid $15 a day. Half of them were chosen to act as guards, while the other half became prisoners. The study was supposed to last 2 weeks to see how people behaved in these roles. Things went wrong very quickly. The guards started abusing their power, treating the prisoners harshly, and using verbal and psychological abuse.
Shut the fuck up! Shut!
The prisoners, on the other hand, became stressed, anxious, and even depressed. The situation got so bad that the experiment had to stop after just 6 days instead of 2 weeks. The impact of the experiment was serious. Many participants were left emotionally harmed because of the extreme stress they went through. The study also showed clear ethical problems. Zimbardo and his team didn't step in to stop the harm when it started, and there weren't enough rules in place to protect the people involved. Even though the experiment was flawed, it revealed important truths about human behavior. It showed how easily people could act cruelly when given power and authority.
I'll smash this camera! I'll beat up guards! I want out, and I want out right now!
This controversial study also led to big changes in research rules. Today, experiments must follow strict guidelines to make sure participants are safe and treated with respect. The Stanford prison experiment is still remembered as a lesson about the dangers of unchecked power. But if you think this was shocking, wait until you hear the next experiment on our list. The baby chimp. Psychologist Winthrop N. Kellogg and his wife, Luella, carried out a strange experiment in 1931. They brought a baby chimpanzee named Gua into their home and raised her alongside their infant son, Donald. Their goal was to see if a chimp could learn to behave like a human or even think of itself as one. For 9 months, the Kelloggs tested both children. They measured memory, reflexes, language, physical skills, and even blood pressure. Gua often did better than Donald at first,
Gua did run to her caregiver. Donald did not.
showing impressive dexterity and problem-solving. However, as time went on, Gua's progress slowed down. She couldn't keep up with Donald because, in the end, she was still a chimpanzee. The experiment ended suddenly, and Gua was sent to a primate colony to live with other chimps.
They wanted to see whether they would seek out support from their caregivers.
People wondered why it stopped so quickly. Some believe Gua's growing strength may have posed a danger to Donald. Others think the experiment confused Donald, as he started to act more like Gua than a human child. This study showed how humans and chimps develop differently, but it also had serious ethical problems. Neither Gua nor Donald was properly protected, which showed the lack of rules for such experiments at the time. While it gave scientists valuable insights, the experiment also proved the need for better safety and ethical guidelines in research involving both animals and children.
Okay. Donald didn't seem to like it, but Gua didn't mind.
LSD and the elephant. In the 1960s, a group of scientists wanted to study a behavior in male elephants called musth. During this time, elephants can become very aggressive and hard to control. The scientists hoped to find a way to stop musth by studying it more closely. Their idea was to use LSD, a powerful drug, to see if it could bring on the condition artificially. The elephant chosen for the experiment was Tusco, a 14-year-old Indian elephant at the Lincoln Park Zoo in Oklahoma City. The scientists guessed how much LSD to use, but decided that because elephants are so big, they needed to give a much higher dose than a human would take. They gave Tusco an amount 25 times what is known to cause serious mental effects in people. Tusco reacted badly right away. It had violent seizures and became extremely distressed. The scientists then gave Tusco another drug, hoping to calm him down, but it didn't work. In desperation, they tried a strong barbiturate, a drug used to end lives in executions. Sadly, Tusco did not survive. The death shocked many people and raised serious questions about animal experiments. This experiment failed because it was poorly planned and showed little concern for the elephant's safety. It led to calls for better rules to protect animals used in research. Tusco's death was tragic, but the next experiment was even worse. Stay tuned. The monster study. During the Great Depression, Life was already hard for children in orphanages, but for 22 orphans at the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans' Home in Davenport, it became even worse. In 1939, a speech therapist named Mary Tudor Jacobs ran an experiment that caused lifelong harm. Working under Wendell Johnson, a well-known speech expert at the University of Iowa, she wanted to find out if stuttering was something children were born with or if it was caused by their environment. The children were split into 2 groups of 11. One group was given kind and supportive speech therapy, where they were praised for speaking well. The other group faced harsh criticism of their speech and were told they might develop a stutter. This negative treatment caused some children in the second group, who had no speech problems before, to develop permanent stutters. The experiment caused great emotional and psychological harm to the children. Many struggled with low confidence and communication issues for the rest of their lives. The children had no way to stop what was being done to them, and they didn't understand why it was happening. Tudor was calm and gentle in her approach, which only made what she did seem more cruel. The man who gave Thomas Edison X-ray vision. Clarence Dallas' dedication to science led him down a path of suffering and death. In the late 1890s, he worked as a glassblower and assistant to Thomas Edison, who was developing the first X-ray machines. Dallas's role involved creating and testing these devices, which required him to expose his hands to radiation for extended periods. The goal of their work was to advance medical imaging by harnessing the power of X-rays. Edison believed that these rays could revolutionize medicine by allowing doctors to see inside the human body without surgery. Dallas's hands-on involvement was important to the development of the technology. However, the dangers of radiation exposure were not well understood at the time. Dallas's repeated and prolonged exposure to X-rays led to severe health issues. He developed sores on his left hand, which spread up his arm and to his face. His hair fell out and open wounds appeared. Eventually, his left arm had to be amputated, followed by the loss of 4 fingers from his remaining hand and then his other arm altogether. Tragically, just 8 years after he began working with X-rays, he died at the age of 39. This experiment had devastating consequences for Dallas. His suffering and death led to increased awareness of the dangers of radiation. It made the medical community implement protective measures for those working with X-rays, such as wearing lead aprons and limiting exposure times. This is not the only tragic story. Keep watching to know the next experiment that led to a deadly outcome. Drug trial goes terribly wrong. In 2006, 6 healthy men volunteered for a clinical trial of a new drug called TGN-1412. The trial aimed to test the drug's safety for treating autoimmune diseases and leukemia. The participants were injected with the drug at a dose 500 times smaller than that found safe in animal studies.
Person to receive a drug which is the first time in humans, yeah, probably not the smartest thing.
Within minutes, all 6 men experienced severe reactions, including headaches, vomiting, and shortness of breath. Their bodies began to swell, and some developed distorted features. The trial became known as the Elephant Man trial. The men were rushed to intensive care, where they remained for up to 3 weeks. They suffered from organ failure and required treatments like blood filtration and heart support. One participant lost fingers and toes, and others faced long-term health issues.
They close the curtains. You're just there, left with nothing.
This incident revealed serious flaws in the trial's design and safety measures. The drug's effects were not properly predicted, leading to life-threatening consequences for the volunteers. The tragedy led to stricter regulations for clinical trials. Hurricane seeding experiment. Scientists at General Electric Labs launched Project Cirrus to explore weather modification by seeding hurricanes. 1947. Their goal was to weaken Hurricane King, which was moving over Florida and off the coast. They flew B-17 and B-29 aircraft from Mobile, Alabama, into the storm, releasing crushed dry ice into the clouds. The scientists hoped this would reduce the hurricane's strength.
Number one, before the storm even got there, we had what we would call a pre-event.
However, the next day, Hurricane King changed course and intensified, hitting Savannah, Georgia, and then South Carolina, causing over $2 million in damage and 1 death. The scientists were blamed for worsening the storm and altering its path. Although lawsuits against General Electric were eventually dropped, the incident raised concerns about the safety and ethics of weather modification experiments. This event led to stricter regulations and a more cautious approach to such experiments in the future. Aside from this, the next experiment took a darker turn. Keep watching to find out. Stubborn's Firth and the yellow fever. In the 19th century, scientists attempted to weaken hurricanes by seeding them with dry ice. This experiment, known as Project Cirrus, was led by General Electric Labs, a company specializing in electrical and electronic technologies. The goal was to reduce the strength of hurricanes to prevent damage. The team flew B-17 and B-29 aircraft from Mobile, Alabama, into Hurricane King, which was moving over Florida and off the coast. They released crushed, dry ice into the storm clouds, hoping to weaken the hurricane. However, the hurricane unexpectedly changed course, strengthening as it moved towards Savannah, Georgia, and then south into South Carolina. This deviation caused over $2 million in damage and 1 death. The experiment faced criticism for its lack of understanding of hurricane behavior and the potential consequences of such interventions. Although lawsuits against General Electric were eventually dropped, the incident raised concerns about the safety and ethics of weather modification experiments. High-dose radiation tests on prisoners' testicles. A shocking experiment was done on prisoners in Washington and Oregon in the 1960s and 1970s. Scientists led the experiment to see how much radiation would make men infertile. They wanted to protect astronauts and workers in atomic energy plants from radiation. The scientists paid prisoners $5 a month and promised $100 and a vasectomy after the experiment. The prisoners got 400 rads of radiation, like getting 2,400 chest X-rays, but the prisoners were not told about the dangers of radiation to their health. The experiment had terrible results. The prisoners got sick from radiation, and their health problems were ignored. This experiment was very wrong and ignored the prisoners' rights and dignity. We learned important lessons from this bad experiment. People taking part in experiments must be treated with respect, and their rights must be protected. Scientists must follow ethics rules to prevent terrible things like this from happening again. This was just one of many experiments where ethics were ignored. The next experiment will surprise you. The Milgram Shock Experiment. In 1963, psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted a controversial experiment at Yale University to understand obedience to authority. He aimed to explore how far individuals would go in following orders, even when those orders conflicted with their personal morals. Milgram's experiment involved 40 male participants, aged 20 to 50, from various professions. They were told they were part of a study on learning and memory. Each participant was assigned the role of teacher, while an accomplice of Milgram's, posing as a learner, was strapped to a chair in another room. The teacher was instructed to administer electric shocks to the learner for each incorrect answer, with the shocks increasing in voltage with each mistake.
Well, I tell them we're going over it again. No, just go ahead.
The shocks ranged from 15 volts to 450 volts. Unknown to the teacher, the learner was not actually receiving shocks, but was acting in response to the teacher's actions. As the experiment progressed, the learner began to protest, then scream, and eventually fell silent, indicating distress. Despite the learner's apparent suffering, Many teachers continued to administer shocks when prompted by the experimenter, who insisted they continue. The results were alarming. 65% of participants administered the maximum 450-volt shock, and all participants continued to at least 300 volts. This demonstrated a high level of obedience to authority figures, even when it involved harming another person. Participants were subjected to severe stress, believing they were causing real harm. They were not fully informed about the nature of the experiment, which violated ethical standards of informed consent. The deception used in the study led to emotional distress for the participants, raising concerns about the morality of such research. Milgram's study had an impact on psychological research ethics, the Guatemala syphilis experiment. American researchers faced a major issue in 1940. Many soldiers contracted syphilis and other transmitted infections during World War II. To solve this problem, a team of doctors and medical experts decided to conduct an experiment in Guatemala. Their goal was to test if penicillin could help prevent or treat syphilis and other STIs. Unfortunately, this experiment turned into one of the most shameful episodes in medical history. The team was led by Dr. John Cutler, a doctor working for the U.S. Public Health Service, along with other medical professionals. They traveled to Guatemala and began an experiment that involved infecting more than 5,500 people with syphilis, gonorrhea, and other transmitted infections. These people were chosen because they were vulnerable. Many were prisoners, soldiers, or patients with mental health conditions. The researchers intentionally exposed them to these diseases by having infected prostitutes spread the disease to them. They then tested penicillin on the victims, hoping to see if it could prevent or treat the infections. What went wrong during the experiment was clear from the beginning. The researchers did not get permission from the people involved. They never asked for informed consent, meaning the victims had no idea they were being used as test subjects. The results were tragic. Many of the people who were infected with the diseases suffered long-term health problems, and some even died. The worst part was that these people were treated as nothing more than tools to benefit the US soldiers, with no regard for their well-being. The experiment in Guatemala caused huge damage. It violated the basic rights of thousands of people. The US government did not acknowledge the wrongdoings until 2010, when they offered an apology to the survivors and their families. Beyond this, there is another experiment that cannot be easily forgotten. Let's find out what went wrong. The Space Shuttle Challenger. On January 28, 1986, the world was shocked when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded just 73 seconds after liftoff from Cape Canaveral, Florida. The mission was special because it carried Krista McAuliffe, a schoolteacher who was the first civilian chosen to go to space. Students across the United States were watching the launch live, making the tragedy even more heartbreaking. The loss of McAuliffe and the other astronauts marked a tragic day in space history and touched millions of people. The Challenger mission involved NASA engineers, astronauts, and experts. The shuttle's purpose was to carry out a routine mission, which included deploying satellites and conducting scientific experiments. Krista McAuliffe was also going to teach lessons from space to inspire students. Unfortunately, just over a minute after liftoff, the shuttle broke apart in a huge explosion, killing all 7 crew members on board, including McAuliffe, Francis Scobie, and Michael Smith. An investigation into the explosion found that it was caused by the failure of an O-ring seal in one of the solid rocket boosters. The O-ring didn't work properly due to the cold weather on the day of the launch. This caused hot gas to leak, setting off a chain of events that led to the shuttle's explosion. Despite engineers' concerns about the cold and the risks involved, the shuttle was cleared for launch because of pressure to meet deadlines. The Challenger disaster had serious consequences. All 7 astronauts lost their lives, and NASA's space program was halted for nearly 2 years. The event led to public anger and criticism of NASA's safety practices. A commission, called the Rogers Commission, was set up to investigate the disaster and make recommendations. The investigation revealed many safety issues and pushed NASA to make major changes. Unit 731. During the 1930s and 1940s, a chilling series of experiments were conducted by the Imperial Japanese Army in the infamous Unit 731, which is now remembered as one of the most horrific wartime atrocities. The team behind these experiments consisted of military doctors and scientists led by Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii. Their goal was to develop biological and chemical weapons to use against enemies during World War II. However, their research involved brutal and inhumane experiments on over 3,000 Chinese prisoners, many of whom were subjected to unimaginable pain and suffering. The experiments conducted in Unit 731 were far from scientific. They were acts of torture disguised as research. Prisoners were vivisected while alive, with no anesthesia used. Organs and limbs were removed, and individuals were deliberately infected with diseases such as cholera, typhus, and plague to study the effects. The prisoners were treated as expendable objects, and their suffering served no greater purpose than the military's desire for deadly biological agents. The consequences were horrific, with countless lives lost and many others ruined. The most disturbing aspect, however, was the United States' role in allowing the perpetrators to escape justice. After the war, the US government granted immunity to the doctors and researchers involved in these war crimes in exchange for the information gathered from their experiments. This decision allowed many of these individuals to continue their careers in business, medicine, and academia, all while their brutal past remained hidden. What are your thoughts on these disturbing experiments? Do you think enough has been done to prevent such atrocities from happening again? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Also, click on the next video on your screen. You won't want to miss it.